The church bells of Millbrook rang out across the dusty prairie, but they weren't celebrating a wedding. Inside the whitewashed chapel, a young woman in a torn wedding dress sat bound to a wooden chair, blood trickling from a cut on her cheek. The townspeople filled every pew, their faces a mixture of fear and anticipation. Outside, the sound of spurs hitting wooden steps echoed through the silence. Someone was coming. Someone who would change everything the next few minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other in Millbrook, Texas. The sun crested over the rolling hills, casting long shadows across Main Street as shopkeepers began opening their doors. Clara Whitmore stood at the window of her boarding house room, adjusting the delicate lace sleeves of her wedding dress. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. At 23, Clara had waited longer than most women in town to marry. She'd turned down 3 proposals from local ranchers, much to her father's frustration. But when Thomas Hawthorne rode into town 6 months ago with his smooth talk and city manners, everything changed. He claimed to be a businessman from Dallas, looking to invest in cattle ranching. Within weeks, he'd swept Clara off her feet with promises of a life beyond the dusty confines of Millbrook. The Whitmore family had been pillars of the community for 2 generations. Clara's father, Samuel, owned the largest general store in 3 counties, and her mother, Margaret, organized every church social and charity drive. They were respected, God-fearing people who believed in doing right by their neighbors. When Thomas asked for Clara's hand, Samuel gave his blessing despite nagging doubts about the stranger's background. As Clara fastened her grandmother's pearl necklace, a commotion erupted outside. Raised voices carried through the morning air, followed by the sound of horses galloping hard down Main Street. She peered through the lace curtains and saw a group of men she didn't recognize riding toward the church. They wore dark clothing and had the hard look of men accustomed to violence. Margaret Whitmore burst into the room without knocking, her face pale with worry. "Clara, we need to talk. Your father's discovered something terrible about Thomas." The older woman's hands shook as she closed the door behind her. "He's not who he claims to be. Samuel received a telegram from Dallas this morning. There's no record of Thomas Hawthorne in any business directory, but there are warrants for a man matching his description. Robbery, fraud, and worse." Clara's heart sank, but before she could respond, heavy boots thundered up the boarding house stairs. The door flew open, and Thomas strode in, no longer the charming gentleman who'd courted her. His eyes were cold, calculating, and behind him stood 3 rough-looking men with guns on their hips. "Ladies, I'm afraid there's been a change of plans," Thomas said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. "Clara, my dear, you're still going to be useful to me, just not in the way you expected." The truth spilled out in bitter waves. Thomas wasn't a businessman at all. He was the leader of a gang that had been robbing banks and trains across 3 states. Millbrook had been chosen not for its investment potential, but because it was isolated, wealthy enough to be worth the effort, and had no telegraph connection to the outside world until recently. The wedding had been a perfect cover. While the entire town gathered at the church for the ceremony, Thomas's men would rob the bank, clean out the general store safe, and steal anything else of value. By the time anyone realized what had happened, they'd be long gone. Clara had been nothing more than a convenient way to ensure the whole town would be distracted in one place, but Samuel's telegram had ruined everything. Word was already spreading through town about Thomas's true identity. The gang couldn't simply disappear now. Too many people had seen their faces, knew their names. They needed a new plan, and Clara had become their insurance policy. Margaret tried to step between her daughter and the armed men, but one of them grabbed her roughly and shoved her aside. "Please, take whatever you want, but leave Clara alone," she pleaded. Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Oh, we're still having a wedding, Mrs. Whitmore. Just not the kind you planned. Your daughter is going to help us get out of this town safely. And if anyone tries to stop us, well." He let the threat hang in the air. They forced Clara and her mother downstairs at gunpoint. Outside, more of Thomas's men had taken control of the main street. They'd rounded up several prominent townspeople, including the banker, the sheriff, and the mayor. Anyone who might organize resistance was now under guard. The church bells began to ring, just as they had been scheduled to for the wedding ceremony. But instead of celebration, they now summoned the town to witness something far darker. Thomas's men herded everyone toward the chapel, using the very gathering that was meant to celebrate Clara's happiness to ensure their escape. Inside the church, the scene was a mockery of the joyous occasion it should have been. The flowers Clara had carefully arranged the day before still decorated the altar, but now armed men stood where the wedding party should have been. The congregation filled the pews, but their faces showed terror instead of joy. Thomas forced Clara to the front of the church, where the minister, Reverend Patterson, stood pale and shaking. "Go ahead, Reverend," Thomas commanded. "Tell everyone why we're here." The elderly minister's voice trembled as he explained the situation. Thomas's gang had taken control of the town. They would release everyone unharmed, but only after they'd had time to escape safely. Clara would be going with them as insurance. If anyone tried to follow or alert the authorities, she would pay the price. It was then that one of the townspeople, emboldened by desperation, tried to rush the altar. Thomas drew his gun and struck the man down, and in the struggle, Clara was knocked to the ground. She hit her head on the wooden step, opening a gash on her cheek that began to bleed down her white dress. "Tie her up," Thomas ordered coldly. "Since the good people of Millbrook can't behave themselves, we'll make sure they understand the consequences of heroics." They bound Clara to a chair in full view of the congregation, her wedding dress now stained with blood. Margaret sobbed from her pew, restrained by one of the gang members. Samuel sat rigid with fury, calculating whether he could reach his daughter before the gunman could stop him. The church fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by Clara's quiet whimpers and her mother's muffled cries. Thomas paced in front of the altar like a predator, occasionally checking his pocket watch. His men were positioned at every exit, ensuring no one could leave or enter without their knowledge. 2 more hours, Thomas announced to the crowd. That's how long it takes to reach the county line. After that, your precious Clara will be free to go, assuming no one has been foolish enough to send for help. But as he spoke, none of them heard the sound of a horse approaching the church at a steady gallop. None of them noticed the shadow that fell across the front steps, or the jingle of spurs that had gone quiet just outside the door. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its lonely song across the prairie grass. The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees that lined the church property, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made a person believe the world was fundamentally good, that justice existed, and that sometimes, when evil seemed to have the upper hand, fate would send exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Inside the church, Thomas checked his watch again and smiled with satisfaction. Everything was going according to his revised plan. In a few hours, he'd be across the state line with enough money to keep his gang comfortable for months. The girl would slow them down, but she was pretty enough that someone would pay good money for her in Mexico. He had no way of knowing that his carefully laid plans were about to be shattered by a man he'd never met, someone who had no connection to Millbrook or its people, but who possessed something that had become increasingly rare in their corner of the world: an unshakable sense of right and wrong, and the skill to back it up. The congregation remained frozen in their pews, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Parents held their children close, and husbands gripped their wives' hands. They were simple people, farmers, shopkeepers, and their families, who had never faced anything like this. They looked to their leaders for guidance, but the sheriff sat disarmed and helpless. The mayor appeared on the verge of collapse, and even Reverend Patterson seemed to have lost his faith in divine intervention. Clara tested the ropes that bound her wrists, but Thomas's men knew their business. The knots were tight, professional. Blood from her cheek had dried into a dark stain on her bodice, and her carefully arranged hair had come loose, giving her a wild, desperate appearance that only emphasized her vulnerability. The morning sun streamed through the church's stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the floor that should have been beautiful, but now seemed ominous. The familiar hymnal smell of old wood and candle wax had been replaced by the sharp odor of fear and the metallic scent of blood. Thomas's confidence grew with each passing minute. He'd pulled off more elaborate schemes than this, and the people of Millbrook were proving to be exactly as predictable as he'd hoped. Frightened, law-abiding citizens who would follow orders rather than risk anyone getting hurt. What he couldn't have predicted was that sometimes the most carefully planned crimes are undone by pure chance. Sometimes a stranger takes a wrong turn and ends up exactly where he's needed most. Sometimes the very isolation that makes a town vulnerable also makes it the perfect place for justice, to be dispensed without interference from courts or lawyers, or the complications of civilized society. The church door remained closed, but outside, spurs rang against wood as someone climbed the front steps. The church door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through every corner of the sanctuary. A figure stepped through the threshold, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence. His boots struck the wooden floor with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and purposeful. Jake Morrison had been riding hard for 3 days, chasing rumors and half-remembered conversations that had led him to this isolated Texas town. At 35, he carried himself like a man who'd seen too much of the world's darkness, but hadn't let it break him. His weathered face bore a 3-day stubble, and his clothes were dusty from the trail. But his eyes remained sharp and alert as they took in the scene before him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The congregation turned as one to stare at the newcomer. Thomas and his men spun toward the interruption, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. But something about the stranger's calm demeanor gave them pause. This wasn't a panicked townsperson or a bumbling local sheriff. This was something else entirely. Jake's gaze swept over the armed men positioned throughout the church, cataloging their positions and weapons with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived similar situations. His attention lingered on Clara, bound and bloodied in her wedding dress, and something cold and dangerous flickered in his expression. "Morning, folks," Jake said, his voice carrying easily through the silent church. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath it. "Beautiful day for a wedding. Though I have to say, this is the strangest ceremony I've ever seen." Thomas stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "This is a private matter, stranger. I suggest you turn around and ride out of town the way you came." Jake removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, seemingly unconcerned by the weapons pointed in his direction. "That's interesting advice, but I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, I've been looking for you, Thomas Hawthorne. Or should I call you by your real name, William Garrett?" A murmur ran through the congregation. Even bound to her chair, Clara's eyes widened. Thomas's carefully constructed facade cracked just slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do," Jake replied, taking another step into the church. "William Garrett, formerly of Kansas City. Wanted for bank robbery, murder, and trafficking stolen goods. Your gang hit a train outside Abilene 3 weeks ago. Killed a conductor named Pete Summers. Good man, Pete. Had a wife and 3 kids. The pieces began falling into place. Jake Morrison wasn't just a drifter who'd wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a bounty hunter, one of the best in the territory, and he'd been tracking Thomas's gang across 3 states. That train was carrying more than just money, Jake continued, his voice never losing its conversational tone. It had a strongbox bound for the Territorial Bank in Austin. Government money, federal crime, William. That makes you my business now. Thomas's men shifted nervously. They'd signed on for robbery and maybe some intimidation, but facing down a federal bounty hunter was beyond their pay grade. Jake sensed their uncertainty and pressed his advantage. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, addressing the entire church but keeping his eyes on Thomas. "You're going to untie that young lady, and you're going to surrender your weapons. Then we're going to walk outside together, nice and peaceful, and settle this matter properly." Thomas laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're outnumbered 6-1, bounty hunter. Even if you are fast with that gun, you can't take us all." Jake smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Maybe not, but I guarantee I'll take you first, William. And probably 2 or 3 of your boys before they put me down. Question is, which ones want to die for your mistake?" The church fell silent, except for the sound of Clara's labored breathing and the rustle of fabric as people in the pews tried to make themselves smaller. Jake could see the doubt creeping into the faces of Thomas's men. They were hired guns, not fanatics. When the shooting started, loyalty only went so far. "Besides," Jake added, pulling back his coat to reveal not just his gun, but a deputy marshal's badge pinned to his vest, "I didn't come alone." That was a lie, but it was a convincing one. Thomas's eyes darted toward the windows, looking for signs of other lawmen. Jake used the distraction to take 2 more steps into the church, closing the distance between himself and the nearest gunman. "You're bluffing," Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Am I?" Jake reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out a folded paper. "This is a federal warrant for your arrest, signed by Judge Harrison himself. It also authorizes me to use any force necessary to bring you in. That includes civilian casualties, if you've endangered innocent people." The warrant was real enough, though Jake was stretching the truth about his authority. He'd been tracking Thomas's gang for weeks, following a trail of violence and theft that had led him to Millbrook purely by chance. He'd stopped at a ranch 20 miles out to water his horse, and heard talk of a stranger marrying into the Whitmore family. Something about the description had sounded familiar. One of Thomas's men, a nervous-looking kid who couldn't have been more than 20, began edging toward the door. "Boss, maybe we should stay where you are, Danny," Thomas snapped. But the authority in his voice was cracking. His carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart, and everyone in the church could sense it. Jake took another step forward. "What's it going to be, William? You can surrender peacefully, and maybe the judge will take that into consideration when he sentences you. Or you can make this hard, and I'll make sure they know exactly what kind of man you really are." Clara found her voice for the first time since Jake had entered. "Please," she whispered, her words barely audible but carrying clearly in the silent church. "Just let everyone go. They haven't done anything wrong." Jake's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "Don't you worry, miss. Nobody else is going to get hurt today. I give you my word on that." Thomas saw the exchange and recognized an opportunity. "Actually, bounty hunter, I think you're the one who's going to surrender. You see, I've got something you want." He moved behind Clara's chair, pulling out a knife and holding it to her throat. "Drop your gun, or this pretty little bride dies right here in front of God and everybody." The congregation gasped. Margaret Whitmore screamed and tried to rise from her pew, but one of the gang members forced her back down. Samuel's face went white with rage and terror. Jake's demeanor changed completely. The conversational friendliness vanished, replaced by something cold and deadly. That's a mistake, William. A big one. I don't think so. Drop your gun and kick it away, or I open her throat. Jake's hand moved to his gun butt, but he didn't draw. His eyes never left Thomas's face. You know what the difference is between you and me, William. You threaten innocent people because you're weak. Me? I just kill the people who deserve it. Drop the gun. Can't do that. Jake's voice was calm, almost gentle. See, I've been hunting men like you for 15 years. And I've learned something important. When a man threatens to kill a hostage, he's usually too scared to actually do it. Because the moment he does, he loses his only protection. Thomas pressed the knife closer to Clara's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. Try me. Already am. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but to everyone watching, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. Jake's hand moved to his gun. With liquid speed, the weapon clearing leather and coming level faster than the eye could follow. The shot echoed through the church like thunder, and Thomas stumbled backward, the knife flying from his hand, but Jake hadn't aimed to kill. The bullet had shattered Thomas's wrist, leaving him clutching his ruined hand and screaming in pain. The knife clattered harmlessly across the wooden floor. Anyone else want to discuss terms? Jake asked, smoke still rising from his gun barrel. The fight went out of Thomas's men immediately. Faced with a man who could shoot with such precision, under pressure, they began dropping their weapons without being asked. Danny, the young one, actually put his hands up and back toward the wall. Smart choice, Jake said, holstering his gun. He moved quickly to Clara, pulling out a folding knife and cutting through her bonds. You all right, miss? Clara nodded, unable to speak as feeling returned to her hands and arms. Jake helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. Sheriff, Jake called out, spotting the badge on one of the men in the congregation. I believe these gentlemen would like to turn themselves in. The sheriff, a middle-aged man named Anderson, seemed to shake himself out of a trance. He stood up, looking around at the weapons scattered on the floor and the gang members who were now sitting with their hands visible. Ah, yes, of course. Boys, collect those guns. Mrs. Patterson, would you see the young lady's injuries? The minister's wife, a capable woman who'd tended to plenty of ranch accidents over the years, hurried forward with a clean cloth to tend to Clara's wounds. The congregation began to stir, voices rising as the shock wore off, and people began to process what had just happened. Jake retrieved Thomas's fallen knife, examining the blade with professional interest before sliding it into his boot. Thomas was still moaning over his shattered wrist, blood seeping between his fingers. You'll live, Jake told him matter-of-factly, though you won't be handling a gun with that hand anytime soon. Doc in town will patch you up before we head to the territorial prison. Samuel Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't arrived when you did. No thanks necessary, Jake replied. Just doing my job. Though I have to say, your daughter showed more courage than most grown men would have in her situation. Clara looked up from where Mrs. Patterson was cleaning her wounds. How did you know to come here? How did you know about Thomas? Jake's expression grew serious. Been tracking his gang for 3 weeks. They hit that train I mentioned, killed the conductor in cold blood. Pete Summers was a friend of mine. We served together in the cavalry before he took the railroad job. The personal connection explained the intensity Jake had shown, the way he'd handled the situation with such controlled fury. This hadn't just been about justice or bounty money. It had been avenging a friend. I followed them through 4 towns before I lost the trail near Fredericksburg, Jake continued. Was about to give up when I stopped at the Johnson Ranch yesterday evening. Old man Johnson mentioned a stranger who'd been courting the Whitmore girl, planned to marry her today. The description matched the man I was hunting. You rode all night to get here? Clara asked, most of it. Had a feeling something wasn't right. Garrett's not the marrying type, and Millbrook seemed too small for his usual targets. Figured he was planning something bigger than a simple wedding. Sheriff Anderson approached, having secured all the gang members with rope provided by some of the local ranchers. "What's the procedure here, Mr. Morrison?" "I've never dealt with federal prisoners before." Jake considered the question. "I'll take Garrett back with me for trial. The rest of his boys are local jurisdiction, unless you want to turn them over to the territorial authorities. Your choice." The sheriff looked at the 6 remaining gang members, all of whom appeared thoroughly defeated and anxious to cooperate. "I think we can handle them. Millbrook doesn't see much excitement as a rule. After today, that's probably for the best." Jake replied dryly. As the immediate crisis passed, the practical considerations began to surface. Clara was still in her blood-stained wedding dress. Thomas was bleeding on the church floor, and the entire town had been traumatized by the morning's events. Dr. Reynolds, an elderly physician who'd been attending the service, stepped forward to examine Thomas's wound. "He'll need surgery to save full use of that hand, but he's not in immediate danger." "Do what you can, Doc," Jake said, "but keep him conscious. I want him alert for the ride to Austin." The bounty hunter turned back to Clara, who was sitting in the front pew while Mrs. Patterson finished bandaging her cheek. "Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry your wedding day turned into this. No woman should have to go through what you did." Clara managed a weak smile. "It wasn't really my wedding day, was it? I mean, I was about to marry a complete stranger, a criminal. Maybe this was a blessing in disguise." "Maybe so, but you've got good instincts. Most people would have panicked in your situation. You kept your head, didn't make things worse. That took real courage." Outside, the church bells began to ring again, but this time they were celebrating something real. The danger had passed, the criminals were captured, and the town was safe. As the sound echoed across the prairie, Jake Morrison began to think about the long ride ahead and the justice that waited at the end of it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street as Jake Morrison secured his prisoner to the saddle of a sturdy bay horse. Thomas Garrett, his right wrist now splinted and bandaged, sat slumped forward with iron shackles binding his good hand to the saddle horn. Dr. Reynolds had done his work efficiently, extracting bone fragments and setting what remained of the wrist bones. But the man who had terrorized an entire town that morning was now a broken shell of his former self. Jake checked the restraints one final time, his movements methodical and professional. He'd transported dozens of dangerous criminals over the years, and he knew that even wounded men could be unpredictable when desperation set in. The ride to Austin would take 4 days through rough country, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "You comfortable enough, William?" Jake asked, using Thomas's real name deliberately. "Long ride ahead of us." Thomas raised his head with difficulty, his face pale from blood loss and pain medication. "Why didn't you just kill me in there? Would have been cleaner." "Because Pete Summers deserves better than a quick death for his killer. He deserves a trial, a conviction, and a proper hanging. His widow needs to see justice done the right way." The answer seemed to surprise Thomas. In his world, violence was usually met with immediate violence. The concept of justice as a deliberate process was foreign to him. Clara Whitmore emerged from the boarding house, having changed out of her ruined wedding dress into a simple blue traveling outfit. The bandage on her cheek was smaller now, the wound having been properly cleaned and stitched. She walked with purpose toward the 2 men, ignoring the stares of townspeople who were still processing the morning's events. "Mr. Morrison," she called. "Out. I wanted to thank you properly before you left." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "No thanks necessary, Miss Whitmore. Just glad I arrived when I did. It wasn't luck, though, was it? You tracked him here specifically." Clara's voice carried a note of curiosity that hadn't been there before. The trauma of the morning had been replaced by something sharper, more analytical. "Partly. Been following his trail for weeks. but I nearly lost it near Fredericksburg. Your town wasn't on any map I had. Most maps don't show places like Millbrook. We're too small to matter to most people." Clara glanced at Thomas, who was watching their conversation with dull eyes. "I suppose that's what made us attractive." To him, isolated, unsuspecting, Jake nodded. Men like Garrett look for places where nobody expects trouble, where the local law isn't equipped for organized crime. "No offense to Sheriff Anderson." "None taken," the sheriff said, approaching with a leather satchel. "Found this in Garrett's room at the hotel. Might be evidence for the trial." Jake accepted the bag and quickly examined its contents. Banknotes, jewelry, and what appeared to be detailed maps of several small towns across Texas and New Mexico. Looks like Millbrook wasn't his first target, or his last planned one. Clara peered over his shoulder at the maps. "Those other towns, they all look similar to ours. Small, isolated, with banks but no telegraph connections." "Until recently," Jake observed, noting the fresh telegraph lines that had been strung to Millbrook just months before. "That's probably what spooked him this morning. Once your father could wire Dallas about his background, his whole plan fell apart." Thomas stirred in his saddle. "You think you're so smart, bounty hunter, but there are others. My operation was bigger than just these few towns." Jake's expression hardened. "What others? Wouldn't you like to know?" Thomas managed a weak smile despite his pain. "You got me, but you didn't get the real prize." "What's he talking about?" Clara asked. Jake studied Thomas's face, reading the mix of pain and malicious satisfaction there. "He's talking about a larger organization. Garrett here wasn't the boss. Just a lieutenant." "Very good," Thomas said mockingly. "But you'll never find them. They don't leave trails like I did. They're smarter, more careful. We'll see about that." Jake closed the satchel and secured it to his own saddle. 4 days is a long time to ride in silence. Men talk when they're in pain and facing the gallows. The threat was clear enough. Thomas fell silent, but Jake could see the calculation in his eyes. The wounded man was weighing his options, considering what information might buy him a lighter sentence. Samuel Whitmore approached the group, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of metal. "Mr. Morrison, the town council met briefly this afternoon. We want you to have this." Jake opened the bag to find gold coins and currency totaling what looked like several $100s. "That's generous, sir, but not necessary. The federal warrant carries its own reward." "It's not about the money," Samuel replied firmly. "It's about what you did for Clara, for all of us. You risked your life for people you'd never met. Any decent man would have done the same. But most men aren't capable of what you did in that church. That shot you made, with all those people around, with a knife at my daughter's throat." Samuel shook his head in amazement. "I've seen plenty of good shots in my time, but nothing like that." Jake accepted the money reluctantly, understanding that refusing it would insult the town's gratitude. "I'll make sure Pete Summers' widow gets half of this. She's got children to raise." The gesture clearly impressed Clara, who had been studying Jake with growing interest throughout the conversation. "Mr. Morrison, may I ask you something personal?" "Depends on the question." "How long have you been doing this? Hunting criminals, I mean." Jake considered the question while adjusting his horse's bridle. 15 years, give or take. Started after the war, when there wasn't much else for an ex-cavalry officer to do. Turned out I had a talent for it. Don't you ever want to settle down? Have a normal life? The question caught Jake off guard. Most people asked about the danger, the violence, the loneliness of life on the trail. But Clara was asking about something deeper, more personal. "Thought about it once or twice," he admitted. "But this work, it matters. Men like Garrett prey on decent people who can't defend themselves. Somebody has to stop them." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "And you think that somebody has to be you?" "Someone has to do it. Might as well be someone who's good at it. Thomas laughed bitterly from his saddle. Listen to him, girl. The great hero sacrificing his happiness for justice. You want to know the truth? He does it because he likes the killing. He's just better at lying to himself about it than most. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he caught himself. You're entitled to your opinion, Garrett. But I notice you're still breathing despite what you did to Pete Summers. If I enjoyed killing as much as you think, you'd be decorating a headstone right now. Maybe, or maybe you just want to watch me hang. Maybe I do. Jake's voice was cold. Pete was a good man with a family. You shot him down like a dog for $20 and a gold watch. If watching you hang brings his widow some peace, then I'll be there with a smile on my face. The brutal honesty of the statement silenced Thomas completely. Clara stepped closer to Jake, lowering her voice so the prisoner couldn't hear. Is that really why you do this, for revenge? Jake met her eyes, seeing genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Started that way, I suppose. After the war, there were a lot of men like me who came home to find everything changed. Some turned to drink, some to crime. I turned to hunting the ones who chose crime. But it's not just revenge anymore. No, somewhere along the way, it became about something bigger, about making sure places like Millbrook can exist without fear. About making sure young women like you can get married without worrying about predators in sheep's clothing. Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What if I told you I wasn't sure I wanted to get married at all, to anyone? The question surprised Jake more than he cared to admit. That would be your choice to make. Though I suspect you'll have plenty of suitors once word spreads about how you handled yourself. Today, that's not what I meant. Clara glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. I mean, what if I wanted to do something different with my life? Something more than just being someone's wife and raising children? Jake studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. The trauma of the morning had awakened. Something in Clara Whitmore, some sense of possibility that hadn't existed when she was simply a merchant's daughter preparing for a conventional marriage. Like what? I don't know yet. But watching you today, seeing how you handled that situation, it made me realize there's a whole world outside Millbrook that I've never seen. Problems that need solving, people who need help. It's a hard world. Out there, Jake warned. Harder than you might think. Harder than being tied up and threatened with a knife by a criminal who was planning to sell me in Mexico. Clara's voice carried a note of steel that reminded Jake of his own determination. He had to admit she had a point. What would your parents say about ideas like that? They'd be horrified. But they're not the ones who have to live my life. Clara paused, then added quietly, besides, after today, I don't think I can go back to pretending that Millbrook is the whole world. Jake understood. The feeling. He'd felt the same way after his first real gunfight, the realization that there were depths to life and death that most people never experienced. It changed a person fundamentally. Miss Whitmore, he said carefully, what happened today was traumatic. Sometimes people make big decisions when they're still processing something like that. You might want to give yourself some time before you decide to turn your life upside down. Clara smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it was a genuinely happy expression. Mr. Morrison, I was about to marry a man I barely knew because it was expected of me. I was going to spend the rest of my life in a town where nothing ever happens, raising children and organizing church socials. If that's not turning my life upside down, I don't know what is. The logic was unassailable. Jake found himself genuinely impressed by her reasoning, and more than a little intrigued by the possibilities she was suggesting. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. I'm not sure yet. But you said yourself that there are men like Thomas out there, preying on innocent people. You also said that someone has to stop them. What if that someone didn't have to work alone? Jake's eyebrows rose. You're talking about becoming a bounty hunter? I'm talking about learning how. About seeing the world beyond Millbrook and maybe making it a better place in the process. Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. You said I showed courage today. What if I could learn to use that courage for something important? It was an extraordinary proposition, and Jake found himself seriously considering it, despite all the reasons he should dismiss it immediately. Clara had indeed shown remarkable composure under pressure. She was clearly intelligent, observant, and possessed of a moral compass that pointed true north. But she was also a sheltered young woman with no experience of the violence and hardship. That defined his world. It would mean giving up everything you know, he said finally. Your family, your home, any chance of a normal life. It would mean sleeping on the ground, going days without proper food, facing men who would kill you without hesitation if they got the chance. It would also mean stopping those men from hurting other people the way Thomas hurt me today. Clara's voice was steady, determined. Mr. Morrison, I've spent 23 years doing what was expected of me. I've been the dutiful daughter, the proper young lady, the perfect potential wife. And where did it get me? Tied to a chair with a knife at my throat, about to be sold like livestock. Jake couldn't argue with her logic, but he could see the practical problems. Even if you were serious about this, and even if you had the talent for it, it would take years to learn what you'd need to know. Years of training, of learning to shoot, to track, to read people and situations. Then I guess I'd better start soon. Clara's smile was determined now, almost challenging. Unless you don't think a woman could learn those things. The challenge was expertly delivered. Jake had known female soldiers during the war, had seen women defend their homes and families with courage that matched any man's. The idea that gender automatically disqualified someone from dangerous work was one he'd abandoned long ago. I think, he said slowly, that the right woman with the right training and the right motivation could be just as effective as any man in this business. Maybe more effective in some situations. Because people underestimate women? Among other reasons. Jake glanced at Thomas, who was listening to their conversation with obvious interest despite his pain. What do you think, Garrett? Could a woman be a successful bounty hunter? Thomas snorted dismissively. Women don't have the stomach for real violence. They're too soft, too emotional. Clara stepped closer to the prisoner, her voice deadly quiet. Thomas, you held a knife to my throat this morning. You threatened to sell me to brothels in Mexico. You terrorized an entire town full of innocent people. And now you're trussed up like a Christmas goose, missing half the bones in your wrist, about to be hanged for murder. If you want to talk about who's too soft and emotional for violence, I'd suggest you look in a mirror. The rebuke was delivered with such cold precision that even Jake was impressed. Thomas's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he had no comeback. The woman he'd dismissed as weak had just systematically destroyed his argument, using his own failures as evidence. Point taken, Jake said quietly. Miss Whitmore, if you're serious about this conversation, we should continue it on the trail. I've got a long ride ahead, and I need to get moving before dark. Clara nodded. I understand, but Mr. Morrison? This conversation isn't over. When you get back from Austin, we're going to talk about this properly. As Jake mounted his horse and prepared to leave Millbrook behind, he found himself looking forward to that conversation more than he cared to admit. Clara Whitmore had surprised him today in ways that went far beyond her courage under fire. She'd challenged his assumptions about women, about partnership, and about the solitary nature of his work. The ride to Austin suddenly seemed much longer than 4 days. The Texas landscape stretched endlessly in all directions as Jake Morrison guided his horse along the dusty trail toward Austin. Behind him, Thomas Garrett swayed in his saddle, the combination of pain medication and exhaustion keeping him docile for the moment. The afternoon heat shimmered off the rocky ground, creating mirages that danced on the horizon like phantom lakes. Jake's mind wasn't on the scenery or even on his prisoner. Instead, he found himself replaying his conversation with Clara Whitmore, analyzing her words and the determination he'd seen in her eyes. In 15 years of bounty hunting, he'd never encountered anyone quite like her. Most people who witnessed violence either broke under the pressure or became hardened by it. Clara seemed to have found a third option: transformation. Thomas stirred in his saddle, lifting his head with obvious effort. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" The girl back in Millbrook. Jake kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Just watching for trouble. These hills are perfect for ambushes." "Sure they are." Thomas's voice carried a note of mocking amusement despite his pain. "But that's not what's got you distracted. It's her crazy talk about becoming a bounty hunter. Nothing crazy about wanting to make the world a better place. There's plenty crazy about a sheltered little rich girl thinking she can survive in our world." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his restraints. "You know what'll happen if you take her with you? First real gunfight, she frees up and gets you both killed. Or worse, she'll get herself captured by someone like me, and you'll have to choose between your duty and her life." Jake considered the argument despite its source. Thomas might be a criminal, but he understood the realities of violence better than most. "You seem awfully concerned about someone you held a knife to this morning. I'm concerned about you making a mistake that gets more people killed." Thomas leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "Look, Morrison, I respect what you did back there. That shot you made was something special, but bringing a woman into this business, that's not courage, that's stupidity." Interesting perspective from a man who used a woman as a human shield. Thomas fell silent, but Jake could feel him watching, waiting for another opportunity to plant seeds of doubt. It was a common tactic among criminals facing long prison sentences or execution: try to get inside their captor's head, find weaknesses to exploit. The trail wound through a series of low hills covered with scrub oak and mesquite. Jake knew this country well. He'd ridden through it dozens of times over the years, chasing various fugitives toward the territorial capital. It was empty land, mostly uninhabited except for the occasional ranch or trading post. Perfect country for a man who valued solitude and had no patience for small talk. But today, the solitude felt different. Instead of the familiar comfort of being alone with his thoughts, Jake found himself missing the conversation he'd been having with Clara. Her questions had challenged him in ways he wasn't used to, forced him to examine motivations he'd taken for granted for years. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Jake spotted smoke rising from a chimney about a mile ahead. The Broken Wheel Trading Post sat at the intersection of two cattle trails, offering supplies and shelter to travelers heading in any of 4 directions. Jake had stayed there before. The owner was a former cavalry sergeant named Dutch Vanover, who asked no questions and served decent food. "We'll stop here for the night," Jake announced, guiding his horse toward the ramshackle building. "Don't get any ideas about trying to escape, Garrett. Dutch has a shotgun and no love for outlaws." Thomas didn't respond, but Jake could see him studying the approaching building with professional interest. Even wounded and shackled, the man was still looking for opportunities. Dutch Vanover emerged from the trading post as they approached, his gray beard and weathered face breaking into a grin when he recognized Jake. "Well, I'll be damned. Jake Morrison, as I live and breathe. Been a while since you've been through these parts, Dutch." Jake dismounted and shook hands with the older man. "Got a prisoner needs watching overnight. Can you spare a room with good locks?" Dutch glanced at Thomas, taking in the shackles and bandaged wrist. "Depends on who he is and what he's done. I don't harbor murderers or child killers." William Garrett. Bank robber, train robber, murdered a railroad conductor in cold blood. He's bound for Austin and the gallows. In that case, I've got just the place. Dutch led them around to the back of the building, where a small stone shed separate from the main structure. Built this for storing valuables, but it'll hold a man just fine. 3-inch oak door, iron hinges, no windows. He won't be going anywhere. Jake helped Thomas down from his horse, noting that the prisoner was weaker than he'd been that morning. The combination of blood loss, pain, and the stress of capture was taking its toll. Doc Reynolds said you might run a fever tonight. The bullet did some damage to the bones in your wrist. Worried about me, bounty hunter? Thomas managed a weak smile. How touching. Just worried about delivering you alive. Dead prisoners don't hang, and hanging's what Pete Summers deserves. Dutch unlocked the shed and peered inside, checking to make sure it was secure. Haven't used this in months. Might be a bit stuffy, but it's solid. You want me to bring him some food and water? Appreciated. And Dutch? He's clever and desperate. Don't get close enough for him to grab you, and don't trust anything he says. Son, I've been dealing with desperate men since before you were born. I know the type. Jake secured Thomas inside the shed, double-checking the locks and testing the door. Satisfied that his prisoner was secure, he returned to the main building, where Dutch was already preparing a meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. So, Dutch said, stirring the beans over an open fire, what's eating at you tonight? You've got the look of a man with something on his mind. Jake settled into a wooden chair, grateful to be off his horse after the long day's ride. What makes you think something's eating at me? 15 years I've known you, Jake. You're usually as calm as a Sunday morning. No matter what kind of trouble you're hauling behind you, tonight you're wound up like a watch spring. The older man's observation was uncomfortably accurate. Jake prided himself on his emotional control, his ability to compartmentalize the various stresses of his dangerous profession. But Clara's words had unsettled something fundamental in his approach to life. Met someone today, Jake said finally. Someone who asked questions I wasn't prepared for, Dutch chuckled. Questions about what you're doing with your life, I'd guess. The kind of questions that make a man wonder if he's been fooling himself about his motivations. Something like that. She pretty? Jake looked up sharply. What makes you think it was a woman? Experience. It's always a woman when a man starts questioning his life choices. Pretty women have a way of making even the most dedicated bachelors wonder what they're missing. Jake couldn't deny the truth of the statement, but it wasn't just Clara's appearance that had affected him. It was her intelligence, her courage, and most of all, her willingness to challenge his assumptions about what was possible. She wants to learn the bounty hunting business, Jake said. Thinks she could be useful as a partner. Dutch raised his eyebrows. That's a new one. Most women want to reform men like us, not join us. What's her background? Jake told him about the events in Millbrook, about Clara's composure under pressure, and her logical dismantling of Thomas's dismissive attitude toward women. Dutch listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making non-committal sounds. Sounds like she's got the temperament for it, Dutch said when Jake finished. Question is, does she have the stomach for what comes next? Sitting calm while someone holds a knife to your throat is one thing. Pulling the trigger when it's kill or be killed is something else entirely. That's what Garrett said. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Dutch served up 2 plates of food, setting one in front of Jake. But being right about the challenge doesn't make him right about the impossibility. I've known some fierce women in my time. Had a sergeant in my unit during the war who could outshoot and outfight half the men under his command. Turned out he was a woman who'd been disguising herself for 3 years. The story surprised Jake. What happened to her? Got herself killed charging a Confederate position at Antietam. Died like a soldier, fighting for what she believed in. Dutch took a bite of beans and chewed thoughtfully. Point is, gender doesn't determine courage or capability. Training and experience do. But could she survive the kind of life I lead? The constant danger, the isolation, the violence? Could you survive the kind of life she's been leading? The social obligations, the restrictions, the endless tedium of small-town respectability. Dutch grinned. Sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe, Jake. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all. Before Jake could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, approaching at a steady pace. Dutch moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. 3 riders, he reported quietly. Armed. They're not pushing their horses, but they're not tourists either. Jake stood and checked his weapons. In his line of work, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Any idea who they might be? Could be anybody. This is a crossroads, Jake. People come through here from all directions, heading to all kinds of places. Dutch picked up his shotgun from behind the counter. But I don't like the way they're sitting their horses. Too alert, too ready. The riders pulled up outside the trading post, their voices carrying clearly through the thin walls. Jake couldn't make out words, but the tone was businesslike, professional. These weren't drifters or cowhands looking for a place to spend the night. A knock came at the door, firm and authoritative. Dutch glanced at Jake, who nodded and stepped back into the shadows where he'd be less visible from the doorway. We're closed for the night, Dutch called out. Come back in the morning if you need supplies. We're not looking for supplies, a voice replied. We're looking for information. About a man who might have passed this way. A bounty hunter named Morrison. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Thomas had mentioned that his gang was part of a larger organization. It seemed that the organization had learned about his capture and was taking steps to secure his release. Don't know anyone by that name, Dutch replied. You boys might want to try the next trading post. It's about 20 miles east. We know he's here, the voice continued. We saw his tracks and we know he's got our friend with him. All we want is to make a trade. The prisoner for something you'll find very valuable. Dutch looked back at Jake, who shook his head firmly. Whatever these men were offering, it wouldn't be worth releasing a murderer like Thomas Garrett. Like I said, you've got the wrong place. I suggest you move along. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of boots hitting the ground as the men dismounted. Jake counted at least 3 sets of footsteps, possibly more. They were spreading out, surrounding the building. Dutch, the voice called out, now carrying a note of menace. We know Morrison's in there, and we know you're harboring a federal prisoner. That makes you an accessory after the fact. Now we can do this easy or we can do this hard, but either way, we're walking out of here with William Garrett. Jake moved to the window on the opposite side of the building, peering out into the darkness. He could see the shapes of men positioning themselves around the trading post, cutting off escape routes. These weren't amateur criminals. They moved with military precision. How many? Dutch whispered. At least 5 that I can see. Probably more. Jake checked his ammunition, counting cartridges by feel. They know their business. So do we. Dutch broke open his shotgun, checking the loads. I've got extra shells. Behind the counter, and there's a rifle in the back room. Question is, do we fight or do we negotiate? Jake considered their options. The trading post was defensible, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. On the other hand, these men had come here specifically to rescue Thomas, which suggested they valued him highly. That could be leverage. Outside, the voice spoke again. We're going to give you 1 more minute to think about this, Dutch. Then we're coming in whether you like it or not. And if we have to come in shooting, well, accidents happen. The threat was clear enough. Jake made his decision. Dutch, go to the back room and get that rifle. When I give the signal, put a couple of shots through the front wall about shoulder height. Make them think twice about rushing the door. What about you? I'm going to have a conversation with our visitors. Sometimes the best defense is making the other side worry about what they don't know. Jake moved to the door, standing to one side so he wouldn't present a target if shooting started. You boys out there, this is Jake Morrison. I hear you want to discuss terms. Now you're being reasonable, the voice replied. We've got something that might interest you. Something worth more than one broken-down bank robber. I'm listening. Information. About the people Garrett was working for. The ones who've been organizing these small-town jobs across 3 territories. You want the little fish, or do you want the big ones? It was an intriguing offer, and Jake had to admit it had merit. Thomas was just one member of a larger criminal enterprise. If these men had information about the leadership, it could lead to arrests that would save countless innocent lives. But it could also be a trap, a way to get him to lower his guard long enough for them to storm the building. In his experience, criminals rarely offered genuine cooperation unless they had something more valuable to protect. What kind of information? Jake called out. Names, locations, plans for future jobs. The whole organization laid out like a map. All we want in return is Garrett and safe passage out of here. And why would you betray your own organization? There was a pause before the voice replied. Because Garrett's capture has compromised everything. The bosses are cutting their losses, eliminating anyone who might talk. We give you Garrett, we're all dead men. But if we give you the bosses instead? The logic was compelling, but Jake had learned to be suspicious of compelling logic from desperate criminals. Still, the possibility of dismantling an entire criminal network was worth considering. I'll need proof that your information is genuine, Jake said. Fair enough. The next job was supposed to be Sweetwater, 3 days from now. Bank robbery during the Harvest Festival, when everyone would be distracted. You can wire the sheriff there, warn them to be ready. Jake knew Sweetwater. It was a thriving farming community about 100 miles northwest of Austin. If these men were telling the truth about the planned robbery, a warning could save lives and property. But if they were lying, he'd be releasing a murderer and possibly walking into an ambush. The decision would have long-lasting consequences, and Jake found himself wishing he had Clara's analytical mind to help him think through the possibilities. Jake, Morrison pressed his back against the wall beside the trading post's front door, his mind racing through possibilities. The offer from Thomas's associates was tempting information about a larger criminal network in exchange for one prisoner, but 15 years of hunting. Dangerous men had taught him that deals made at gunpoint rarely ended well for anyone involved. Morrison. The voice called from outside. We're waiting for an answer. Our patience isn't unlimited. Neither is mine, Jake replied. But I've got questions before I make any deals. First, how do I know you won't just kill me and Dutch the moment I hand over Garrett? A different voice answered this time, younger and less confident than the first. Because we need you alive to verify our information. Dead bounty hunters can't wire sheriffs or collect rewards on bigger fish. The logic was sound, but Jake detected something in the younger man's tone: nervousness, perhaps even fear. These weren't hardened killers like Thomas. They were desperate men trying to save their own skins. Dutch moved quietly to the back room and returned with a Winchester rifle, positioning himself at a window where he could cover the rear of the building. Jake, he whispered, there's something you should know. I've seen these boys before. When? About 2 weeks ago. They stopped here asking about travelers heading toward Austin. Specifically, they wanted to know about anyone matching your description. Dutch peered carefully through the window. I told them I hadn't seen anyone like that, but they seemed to know more than they were letting on. The information changed Jake's understanding of the situation completely. This wasn't a rescue mission organized after Thomas's capture. It was a trap that had been planned in advance. Someone in the larger organization had anticipated that Thomas might be caught and had positioned these men to intercept any bounty hunter who tried to transport him to Austin. You boys have been waiting for me, Jake called out. This whole thing was planned before I ever got to Millbrook. The silence from outside confirmed his suspicion. When the first voice spoke again, it carried a note of grudging respect. You're smarter than most bounty hunters, Morrison. Yes, we've been watching the trails to Austin for 2 weeks. Our sources told us someone was getting close to Garrett. What? Sources? That's part of the information we're offering. Names, locations, people and places you'd never suspect. This organization has been operating for 3 years, Morrison. We've got contacts in law enforcement, territorial government, even some federal positions. The scope of the corruption was staggering, but it also explained how Thomas's gang had been able to operate with such impunity. If they had advance warning of law enforcement movements, they could stay 1 step ahead of any pursuit. Jake made a decision that would have surprised him an hour earlier. All right, I'm willing to discuss terms. But not like this, with guns pointed at each other in the dark. I want to see faces, and I want to examine whatever proof you've got of this information you're peddling. You're not in a position to make demands, Morrison. Actually, I am. Jake's voice hardened. See, you need Garrett alive more than I need these rewards and promotions you're offering. If shooting starts, the first bullet I fire is going through his head. Then where does that leave your negotiating position? It was a bluff. Jake had no intention of executing a prisoner in cold blood. But it was a credible one. The men outside had no way of knowing what kind of man they were dealing with, and bounty hunters had a reputation for ruthlessness that sometimes exceeded reality. You'd kill an unarmed prisoner. I'd kill a murderer who's caused enough trouble. For 1 lifetime. The question is, do you want to risk it? Another long silence followed, broken by the sound of hushed conversation among the men outside. Jake couldn't make out words, but he could hear disagreement in their voices. The younger man who'd spoken earlier seemed to be arguing with the leader, probably advocating for a more cautious approach. Finally, the first voice spoke again. All right, Morrison. We'll do this your way. But we keep our weapons, and you keep yours. First sign of treachery from either side, and this gets messy fast. Agreed. Dutch, light some lanterns and put them outside. I want to see what we're dealing with. Dutch gathered several oil lanterns and stepped carefully onto the front porch, setting them down to illuminate the area in front of the trading post. The light revealed 5 men positioned around the building, all armed but no longer pointing their weapons directly at the door. Jake stepped outside, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. The leader of the group was a tall, lean man in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He wore the clothes of a successful rancher or businessman, not the rough garb Jake associated with common criminals. Name's Fletcher, the man said. Robert Fletcher. Used to be a deputy marshal in Kansas before I got tired of arresting people who made more money in a week than I made in a year. The admission explained a lot about how the organization operated, with someone like Fletcher providing inside information about law enforcement activities. They could plan their crimes with near-perfect intelligence about response times and investigation methods. And you're willing to betray your partners to save your own neck? Fletcher's smile was rueful. Morrison, when you've been in this business as long as I have, you learn that loyalty only goes so far. Garrett's capture has made us all liabilities. The people running this operation don't tolerate loose ends. So you figured you'd cut a deal before they cut your throats. Something like that. Fletcher gestured to one of his companions, a nervous-looking man with a leather satchel. Eddie here used to work for the Territorial Telegraph Office. He's got copies of messages that'll interest you. Eddie stepped forward reluctantly, clutching the satchel like a lifeline. Mr. Morrison, I never wanted to get involved in any of this. They approached me 2 years ago, offered me more money than I'd ever seen just to intercept certain messages and delay others. What kind of messages? Warnings to small towns about suspicious strangers. Requests for information about wanted criminals. Communications between law enforcement agencies. Eddie's hands shook as he opened the satchel. I kept copies of everything, thinking maybe someday I could use them to get out of this mess. Jake examined the papers Eddie handed him, recognizing official telegraph forms and government letterheads. If these documents were genuine, they represented evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial law enforcement. "This message here," Jake said, pointing to one of the telegraph forms. "It's from the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver, warning about a gang operating in small Texas towns. But it's dated 3 weeks ago, and it never reached any of the sheriffs. In this area, I intercepted it," Eddie admitted, "along with a dozen others like it. Every time law enforcement tried to coordinate their response to the gang's activities, I made sure the communications disappeared." Fletcher nodded. "That's just the beginning, Morrison. We've got bank employees who provide information about cash reserves and security procedures. Town officials who tip us off about special events that would make good cover for robberies. Even a federal judge who's been taking money to reduce sentences for our people who do get caught." The scope of the corruption was breathtaking, but Jake remained skeptical. "Why should I believe any of this? You could have forged these documents, made up these stories to buy yourselves time to escape." "Because," Fletcher said quietly, "tomorrow morning you're going to wire the sheriff in Sweetwater about the planned robbery, and he's going to confirm that strangers have been asking questions about the bank and the Harvest Festival. Because you're going to check with the telegraph office in Austin and discover that certain messages from federal law enforcement never reached their destinations. Because everything we're telling you can be verified independently." The challenge was straightforward and compelling. If Fletcher was lying, Jake would discover it within 24 hours. If he was telling the truth, then dismantling this network could prevent dozens of future crimes and save countless innocent lives. But it would also mean releasing Thomas Garrett, the man who'd murdered Pete Summers in cold blood. Jake thought about Pete's widow and children, about the justice they deserved, about the promise he'd made to see Thomas hanged for his crimes. "There's another consideration," Fletcher added, as if reading Jake's thoughts. "Garrett isn't the only one who killed that conductor. My information shows that 3 men participated in that train robbery, and Garrett wasn't even the one who pulled the trigger." Jake's head snapped up. "What? The actual killer was a man named Carson Ridley. He's planning to hit another train next week, this time with passengers aboard. Women and children, Morrison. How many of them are you willing to sacrifice to see one man hang who wasn't even the triggerman?" The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. For 3 weeks he'd been consumed with bringing Pete's killer to justice, only to discover that he might have been chasing the wrong man. The possibility that Carson Ridley was still free, still killing innocent people, made his stomach turn. "You're lying." Fletcher reached into his coat and pulled out a folded newspaper. Abilene Herald, dated 2 weeks after the train robbery. "Read the description of the witnesses gave of the killer." Jake unfolded the paper and found the article Fletcher was referring to. The description of the man who'd shot the conductor didn't match Thomas at all. This killer was described as shorter, heavier, with distinctive scars on his left hand from an old knife fight. "Garrett was there," Fletcher continued, "but he was handling the strongbox while Ridley dealt with the passengers. When the conductor tried to be a hero, Ridley shot him down without hesitation. Dutch had been listening to the conversation from the porch, and now he spoke up. "Jake, I've seen wanted posters for Carson Ridley. Man's got a reputation for killing anyone who gets in his way, innocent or not, if he's planning another train job." The implications were clear. By holding on to Thomas out of a desire for personal revenge, Jake might be enabling a much more dangerous criminal to continue his killing spree. It was exactly the kind of moral complexity that made bounty hunting such a difficult profession. "Even if Ridley was the killer," Jake said slowly, "Garrett was still part of the gang. He's still responsible for Pete's death." "Legally, yes. Morally?" Fletcher shrugged. "That's for you to decide. But I can tell you where Ridley is when he's planning. his next job, and how to catch him with enough evidence to hang him 10 times over. The question is whether you're more interested in justice or revenge. The distinction cut to the heart of everything Jake had been questioning about his life and motivations. Was he a man who served justice, or was he simply someone who used legal authority to satisfy personal vendettas? Before he could answer, a new voice joined the conversation from an unexpected direction. "Seems like a complicated decision," Clara Whitmore said, stepping out of the darkness beyond the lantern light. "Mind if I offer a different perspective?" Jake spun around, his hand instinctively moving to his gun before he recognized her voice. Clara stood at the edge of the light, dressed in riding clothes and leading a horse, as calm and composed as if she'd been expected all along. "Miss Whitmore, what in hell are you doing here?" "Following you," she replied matter-of-factly. "After you left this afternoon, I realized I didn't want to wait for your answer about our conversation. So I decided to come find you and continue it in person." Fletcher and his men had drawn their weapons the moment Clara appeared, but something about her calm demeanor made them hesitate. She walked toward the group, as if armed criminals were a minor inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. "Ma'am," Fletcher said carefully, "this is a private business discussion. I suggest you turn around and ride back where you came from." Clara smiled at him with the same polite expression she might have used at a church social. "Mr. Fletcher, isn't it? Former deputy marshal from Kansas. I heard your entire conversation from over there in the rocks. Fascinating proposition you're making." Jake felt a mixture of admiration and terror at Clara's boldness. Walking into a standoff between armed men took either incredible courage or incredible foolishness, and he wasn't sure which category her actions fell into. "Clara, this is dangerous. These men are trying to make a deal that benefits everyone," she interrupted. "They get to live, you get information about a larger criminal network, and innocent people in places like Sweetwater don't get robbed and killed. The only person who doesn't benefit is Thomas Garrett, and frankly, after what he put me through this morning, I'm not particularly concerned about his welfare." Fletcher studied Clara with obvious interest. "You're the bride from Millbrook." "The one Garrett took hostage. Former bride," Clara corrected. "Current. Well, I'm still working on that definition. But yes, I'm the woman your associate threatened to sell in Mexico. Then you understand why we need to make this deal. Garrett's capture has put a lot of people at risk, including innocent people who just happened to get caught up in something they never asked for." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that argument, but I also understand Mr. Morrison's position. He made a promise to a dead friend, and keeping promises matters. The question is whether there's a way to honor both obligations." Jake watched Clara work through the problem with the same analytical approach she'd shown earlier. Even in a life-or-death situation, surrounded by desperate criminals, she was thinking clearly and methodically. "What if," she said slowly, "we modify the terms of the deal? Mr. Fletcher, you mentioned that Carson Ridley was the actual killer of the railroad conductor. You also said you know where he is and when he's planning his next crime." "That's right. Then here's what I propose. You give Mr. Morrison the information about Ridley immediately, along with enough evidence to ensure his conviction. In exchange, Mr. Morrison agrees to delay Thomas's transport to Austin for 48 hours, giving you time to get clear of whatever retaliation you're expecting from your former associates." Fletcher frowned. "That's not much of a head start." "It's more than you have now," Clara pointed out. "And it gives Mr. Morrison the chance to fulfill his real obligation, bringing Pete Summers' actual killer to justice. Thomas will still face trial for his crimes, but the most important criminal gets caught first." The proposal was elegant in its simplicity, addressing everyone's primary concerns while avoiding the moral compromise of releasing a prisoner outright. Jake found himself impressed once again by Clara's ability to find solutions where others saw only problems. "There's one more thing," Clara added. Mr. Morrison, you've been thinking about this case in terms of individual justice, punishing the specific person who wronged your friend. But what if you thought about it in terms of systemic justice, stopping the organization that made Pete's death possible in the first place? The distinction hit Jake with the force of revelation. By focusing on Thomas as an individual, he'd been missing the larger picture of the criminal network that had enabled the train robbery. Clara was suggesting that true justice meant dismantling the entire system, not just punishing one participant. The lady makes sense, Dutch said from the porch. Jake, you've always said that stopping crime was more important than revenge. Maybe it's time to prove you meant it. Fletcher looked around at his companions, reading agreement in their faces. Morrison, we'll take the deal your lady friend is proposing. 48 hours to get clear, and we give you everything we know about Ridley and the larger organization. Jake realized that the decision would define not just this case, but his entire approach to justice going forward. And somehow, it seemed fitting that Clara Whitmore was the one who'd helped him see the path clearly. Dawn broke over the Texas Hill Country with the promise of another scorching day. Jake Morrison sat on the porch of the Broken Wheel Trading Post, cleaning his rifle while Clara Whitmore prepared coffee over the fire pit Dutch had built for her. The scene would have looked domestic to any passing traveler, if not for the armed prisoner secured in the stone shed 20 yards away and the stack of incriminating documents spread across a wooden crate between them. Fletcher and his men had vanished into the pre-dawn darkness 2 hours earlier, leaving behind enough evidence to dismantle the criminal network they'd described. Telegraph intercepts, bank correspondence, coded messages, and most importantly, a detailed map showing Carson Ridley's planned route for the next train robbery. The information was overwhelming in its scope and implications. Ridley's going to hit the evening passenger train between Junction and Kerrville, Clara said, reading from Fletcher's notes. Day after tomorrow, when it's carrying the monthly payroll for 3 different ranches. Apparently, he's got inside information about which car the strongbox will be in and how many guards are aboard. Jake looked up from his rifle maintenance. According to this, he's also planning to rob the passengers afterward. Women and children traveling to visit family in San Antonio. His jaw tightened. Fletcher was right about one thing: Ridley doesn't leave witnesses. Clara poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Jake before settling into the chair Dutch had brought out for her. The question is, can we get there in time to stop him? Junction is more than 100 miles from here. We can make it, if we push hard. Change horses in Fredericksburg, ride through the night if necessary. Jake paused, suddenly aware of his choice of pronouns. I mean, I can make it. Clara, this isn't your fight. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, her expression patient but determined. Jake, yesterday morning I was tied to a chair in a church, bleeding from a knife wound, while a criminal threatened to sell me into slavery. Today, I'm sitting here planning to stop a train robbery and catch a killer. I think we've moved past the point where you can tell me what is and isn't my fight. The logic was unassailable, but Jake still struggled with the idea of deliberately putting Clara in danger. Train robberies aren't like what happened in Millbrook. Ridley's gang won't hesitate to shoot anyone who gets in their way, including women. Then we'll have to make sure they don't get the chance. Clara spread out the territorial map Fletcher had provided, tracing the railroad line with her finger. According to this, the train has to slow down for a curve about 5 miles east of Junction. That's where Ridley plans to stop it. Jake studied the map, noting the terrain features marked around the ambush site. It's good ground for what he's planning. Hills on both sides, nowhere for the train to go once it's stopped. But it's also isolated enough that we could approach without being seen. What about local law enforcement? Could we get help from the sheriff in Junction? Fletcher's notes suggest the sheriff there might be compromised. Says he's been taking money to look the other way when certain people pass through town. Jake folded the map carefully. We can't trust anyone in authority until we know how deep this corruption goes. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing. The implications. So it's just us against Ridley's entire gang? Just us, Jake confirmed. Unless you've changed your mind about wanting to see the world beyond Millbrook. Instead of being deterred, Clara smiled with genuine excitement. Jake, 3 days ago my biggest concern was whether the church flowers would match my wedding dress. Now I'm planning to stop a train robbery and catch a murderer. I've never felt more alive in my life. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but Jake forced himself to focus on the practical considerations. Clara, I need to know you understand what we're getting into. These aren't drunk cowboys or small-town bullies. Ridley's men are professional killers who won't hesitate to shoot first and ask questions later. I understand the risks. But I also understand that if we don't stop them, innocent people will die. That train carries families, Jake. People like my parents, like the good folks of Millbrook. If we can prevent that. Jake saw the same sense of purpose in Clara's eyes that had driven him to become a bounty hunter 15 years earlier. She'd found something worth fighting for, something that made the dangers seem worthwhile. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. You follow my lead, you don't take unnecessary risks, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no heroics. Agreed, but Jake, I expect you to treat me like a partner, not like someone who needs protection. If we're going to work together, it has to be as equals. The request was fair, but Jake knew it would require him to overcome 15 years of working alone. I'll try, but it's going to take some getting used to. Dutch emerged from the trading post, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of ammunition. Figured you might need these, he said, setting the bag down between them. Extra cartridges for both rifle and pistol, plus some supplies for the trail. What do I owe you? Jake asked. Nothing. After what you did yesterday in Millbrook and what you're planning to do about this train robbery, consider it a contribution to public safety. Dutch glanced at Clara. Ma'am, you sure about this? It's not too late to head back home and let Jake handle this business alone. I'm sure, Clara replied firmly. Besides, I suspect Mr. Morrison could use someone watching his back. Bounty hunters seem to have a habit of making enemies, Dutch chuckled. That they do. Jake, you picked a good partner. She's got sand, this one. As they prepared to leave the trading post, Jake found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Clara the day before about partnership and the possibility of not working alone anymore. The idea had seemed impossible then, but now, watching her methodically check supplies and study maps with the same intensity he brought to the job, it was beginning to seem not just possible, but inevitable. Clara, he said as they saddled there. Horses, there's something I need to tell you about the bounty hunting business. It changes people. The constant violence, the loneliness, the weight of making life and death decisions. It's not the kind of work you can leave at the end of the day. She paused in securing her bedroll, looking at him with genuine curiosity. Is that what happened to you? Did it change you? The question caught Jake off guard. Most people asked about the excitement or the danger, but Clara was asking about the personal cost. I think it did. Made me harder, more suspicious. Harder to trust people, harder to let anyone get close. And you're worried the same thing will happen to me? I'm worried about what it might cost you. The life you're leaving behind, the person you are now. Clara finished securing her gear and turned to face him directly. Jake, the person I am now is someone who is about to marry a criminal because it was expected of me. Someone who never questioned whether there might be more to life than organizing church socials and raising children. If this work changes me, maybe that's exactly what I need. Before Jake could respond, a commotion from the direction of the stone shed interrupted their conversation. Thomas Garrett was awake and apparently unhappy about something. his voice carrying clearly across the compound as he shouted for attention. "Morrison, I know you're out there. We need to talk." Jake exchanged glances with Clara, then walked over to the shed. Through the small window in the door, he could see Thomas sitting up, his bandaged wrist cradled against his chest. "What do you want, Garrett?" "I want to know what deal you made with Fletcher's boys. I heard voices last night, heard them riding off before dawn." "They cut you a deal, didn't they?" Jake saw no reason to lie. "They gave me information about your organization in exchange for a head start. You're still going to Austin for trial." Thomas laughed bitterly. "You fool. You think Fletcher told you the truth about anything? He's playing you, Morrison. Playing you like a fiddle. What are you talking about? Fletcher wasn't trying to escape from the organization. He is the organization. At least the part that matters. You think a gang like ours could operate for 3 years without someone coordinating everything from the top?" The accusation hit Jake like a cold wind. If Thomas was telling the truth, then Fletcher had just played the most elaborate confidence game Jake had ever encountered. "You're lying. Fletcher gave us proof, documents, telegraph intercepts." "Of course he did. Real documents, real proof of corruption. But he didn't tell you who was coordinating all that corruption, did he? Didn't mention that every crooked sheriff, every corrupt telegraph operator, every bank employee on the take was reporting to him?" Clara had approached during the conversation, and now she spoke up. "Why would Fletcher give us information that could be used against him?" "Because, sweetheart, he's not giving you information that can be used against him. He's giving you information that points to everyone else while making himself look like just another victim of the system." Thomas's voice carried the ring of truth despite his desperate circumstances. "Think about it. Who had access to all those documents? Who knew exactly which messages were intercepted and which officials were corrupt? Someone on the inside, someone coordinating the whole operation." Jake felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Fletcher's knowledge had been too comprehensive, too detailed. A simple gang member wouldn't have access to telegraph intercepts from multiple offices or correspondence between corrupt officials in different territories. "The information about Carson Ridley," Clara said slowly. "If Fletcher is really the leader then Ridley is probably Fletcher's right-hand man. And you're walking into a trap designed to eliminate the one bounty hunter who's gotten too close to the truth." Thomas's smile was triumphant despite his pain. "Congratulations, Morrison. You just agreed to commit suicide." The implications were staggering. If Thomas was telling the truth, then everything Fletcher had told them was designed to get Jake and Clara to a specific place at a specific time, where they could be eliminated quietly and permanently. "Why should I believe you?" Jake asked. "You've got every reason to lie, to try to turn me against Fletcher's information." "Because, bounty hunter, I'm a dead man either way. Fletcher's going to have me killed in prison to keep me from talking, whether you believe me or not. At least this way, I get the satisfaction of watching you figure out how badly you've been played." Clara moved closer to Jake, lowering her voice. "Is there any way to verify what he's saying?" Jake thought about Fletcher's performance the night before, analyzing it with new suspicion. The man had been too calm, too prepared with answers. Most criminals facing exposure were nervous, desperate, prone to mistakes. Fletcher had been cool and professional throughout the entire negotiation. "Dutch," Jake called out. "You said you'd seen Fletcher and his men before. Tell me exactly what they were asking about." Dutch approached the shed, his expression troubled. "They wanted to know about bounty hunters traveling toward Austin. Specifically, they wanted to know if anyone had been asking questions about train robberies or gang activity." "That could be innocent," Clara pointed out, "if they were really trying to avoid capture." "Maybe, but they also asked about the best places to ambush someone on the road to Junction. Said they were planning to avoid certain areas where there might be trouble." Dutch's frown deepened. "At the time, I thought they were just being cautious. Now ... Now it sounds like they were planning an ambush, Jake finished. Thomas, if you're telling the truth about Fletcher, then you know details about his operation that would prove it. Give me something specific. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally he spoke. 3 months ago there was a bank robbery in Lampasas. Clean job, no violence, gang got away with $5,000. Official report said it was an outside gang, probably from Louisiana. But I was there, Morrison. I helped plan it. Jake knew about the Lampasas robbery. It had been one of the cases that had drawn his attention to the pattern of small-town crimes across Texas. Go on. The inside information came from Fletcher. He had a contact in the bank who told him about a large cash transfer that was going to be held over the weekend. But here's what wasn't in any report. The bank president was Fletcher's brother-in-law. Family connection, Morrison. The kind of detail that proves coordination from the top. The specific nature of the claim made it verifiable, and Jake felt his certainty about Fletcher's story beginning to crumble. If Thomas was telling the truth about the family connection, it would be easy enough to check through official records. Clara, he said quietly, we may have walked into something much more dangerous than we realized. She nodded, her face pale but determined. So what do we do? If Fletcher is really setting a trap, we can't just ride to Junction and walk into it. No, we can't. But we also can't ignore the possibility that innocent people are going to be hurt if there really is a train robbery planned. Jake ran his hand through his hair, frustrated by the impossible choices they faced. We need more information, and we need it fast. Thomas cleared his throat. I might be able to help with that, if you're willing to make a different kind of deal. What kind of deal? Get me to a doctor who can fix this wrist properly, and I'll tell you everything I know about Fletcher's real operation. Names, locations, methods, everything. Enough to bring down the whole network. Jake looked at Clara, reading agreement in her eyes. They were facing an enemy more dangerous and sophisticated than either of them had imagined, and they were going to need all the help they could get, even if that help came from the man they'd originally set out to bring to justice. The abandoned silver mine 5 miles north of Junction sat like a scar on the hillside, its entrance partially collapsed from years of neglect. Jake Morrison crouched behind a boulder overlooking the mine, using a small telescope to study the activity below. Clara Whitmore lay beside him, sketching the layout of the mining camp in a notebook she'd brought from Millbrook. Count 7 men, Jake whispered, lowering the telescope. 3 at the entrance, 2 more on the ridge above, and at least 2 inside the mine itself. Clara finished her sketch and showed it to him. If Thomas was right about this being Fletcher's headquarters, then there could be more men underground. These old mines have tunnels that go back for miles. They've been watching the mine for 2 hours, ever since Thomas had finally revealed Fletcher's true base of operations. The prisoner's cooperation had come at a price. Jake had agreed to arrange proper medical treatment for his shattered wrist and to consider reducing his federal charges in exchange for his testimony against Fletcher's organization. It wasn't a decision Jake was comfortable with, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Thomas himself was secured in a cave about a mile behind them, watched over by Dutch Vanover, who'd insisted on joining their expedition despite Jake's protests that he was too old for such dangerous work. The former cavalry sergeant had simply laughed and pointed out that he'd survived worse odds during the war. Movement on the eastern ridge, Clara said quietly, pointing toward a figure emerging from behind the trees. Looks like they're changing. Guards. Jake raised the telescope again, focusing on the man Clara had spotted. That's Eddie Morrison, the telegraph operator who gave us those documents. He's carrying what looks like a message pouch. The sight confirmed Thomas's story about Fletcher's operation. Eddie wasn't a reluctant accomplice trying to escape. He was an active participant, carrying communications between Fletcher and his network of corrupt officials. Jake, Clara said, If Fletcher really is planning to ambush us at the train robbery site, why are so many of his men here at the mine? It was a good question, and Jake had been puzzling over the same issue. Maybe the train robbery was never real. Maybe it was all designed to get us to a specific location where Fletcher could control the situation completely. Clara considered this possibility, then shook her head. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Fletcher could have just had his men attack us at the trading post last night. Why create this complex deception? Jake lowered the telescope, struck by a new thought. Because Fletcher isn't just trying to kill us, he's trying to disappear. Think about it. If we die in a supposed gunfight while trying to stop a train robbery, we look like heroes who died in the line of duty. No one investigates further. No one questions whether the robbery was real or whether Fletcher was involved. And Fletcher gets to walk away clean, maybe even with a reputation as someone who tried to help law enforcement. Clara's eyes widened as she understood the implications. He could start over somewhere else, build a new criminal organization without anyone connecting him to the old one. The plan was diabolically clever, but it also suggested that Fletcher was more desperate than he'd appeared the night before. Something had spooked him badly enough that he was willing to abandon years of careful work and start over. Clara, I need you to work your way around to the north side of the mine. See if you can get close enough to hear what they're saying. But don't take any risks. If they spot you, get out of there immediately. She nodded and began moving carefully through the rocks and scrub brush, staying low to avoid being seen by the sentries. Jake watched her go, impressed by how naturally she'd adapted to this kind of work. Most people would have been paralyzed by fear or made noise that would have given away their position. But Clara moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the stakes. Jake continued his surveillance of the mine entrance, noting the routine of the guards and the layout of the camp. If they were going to have any chance of stopping Fletcher's plan, they'd need to know exactly how many men they were facing and what kind of weapons and supplies the gang had available. 20 minutes later, Clara returned, her face flushed with excitement and information. Jake, you're not going to believe what I heard. Fletcher isn't just planning to fake our deaths, he's planning to rob that train himself. What? I got close enough to listen to Eddie talking to one of the guards. Fletcher's going to let us walk into the ambush site, then attack the train, while we're distracted trying to fight off Ridley's gang. The passengers and cargo will be completely unprotected because everyone will think the robbery is happening somewhere else. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Fletcher would use Jake and Clara as unwitting decoys, letting them believe they were stopping a crime while he committed an even bigger one elsewhere. It was the kind of scheme that required not just criminal cunning, but intimate knowledge of how law enforcement operated. There's more, Clara continued. Eddie mentioned something about a special passenger on tomorrow's train. Someone Fletcher specifically wants to get his hands on. Did you hear a name? Judge Harrison, the federal judge who signed your warrant to arrest Thomas. Jake felt the pieces of Fletcher's plan clicking into place with horrible clarity. Judge Harrison wasn't just any federal official, he was the territorial judge responsible for prosecuting major crimes, including the kind of corruption cases that could bring down an entire criminal network. If Fletcher captured or killed him, it would eliminate the one person who could authorize the kind of coordinated investigation needed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. We have to warn him, Clara said. If Fletcher gets his hands on Judge Harrison, he won't. Jake's voice was grim with determination. Because we're going to stop this before it starts. Clara studied his face, reading the dangerous resolve there. Jake, there are at least 7 men down there, probably more. Even if we could get Thomas and Dutch to help us, we'd still be outnumbered. Numbers don't always matter if you have the right plan and the element of surprise. Jake was already thinking through possibilities, weighing options and calculating risks. Fletcher's expecting us to walk into his trap at the train ambush site. He's not expecting us to attack his headquarters. Attack the mine? Jake, that's suicide. Maybe, but it's also the one thing Fletcher won't be prepared for. He's got his men positioned to defend against a frontal assault or to prepare for the train robbery, but he's not expecting someone to come at him from an unexpected direction. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. What? About the train? If we're attacking the mine, who's going to protect Judge Harrison and the other passengers? Jake had been wrestling with the same question. They couldn't be in two places at once, and both situations required immediate attention. It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that had made him prefer working alone when you were responsible only for yourself. The decisions were simpler. "We send word to the railroad authorities," he said finally. "Tell them to delay the train or reroute it. Remove the temptation entirely. And if they don't believe us? If they think we're just panic-stricken bounty hunters seeing conspiracies?" Everywhere, the possibility was real enough. Without concrete proof of Fletcher's plan, railroad officials might dismiss their warnings as the paranoid fantasies of people who'd been out in the sun too long. Then we make sure Fletcher can't carry out his plan regardless of what happens with the train. Jake turned to look at Clara directly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you prepared to kill someone if you have to?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Clara had shown courage and intelligence, but Jake needed to know if she had the ruthless edge that survival in this business sometimes required. "I don't know," she said finally. "I hope I never have to find out. But if it's a choice between letting Fletcher murder innocent people and stopping him with violence, then yes, I think I could do what needs to be done." The honesty of her answer impressed Jake more than false bravado would have. Anyone who claimed to be eager for violence was probably lying or dangerous, but someone who understood the moral complexity of the situation was someone he could trust to make the right decision under pressure. "All right, here's what we're going to do. We go back to Dutch and Thomas, and we plan this properly. No heroics, no unnecessary risks, just a careful, methodical operation designed to put Fletcher and his men out of business permanently." As they prepared to leave their observation post, Clara grabbed Jake's arm. "There's something else I overheard at the mine. Something about you specifically. What about me? Fletcher knows more about your background than he let on last night. Eddie mentioned something about Jake Morrison being the cavalry officer who broke up a smuggling operation in Kansas 5 years ago. He said Fletcher had a personal score to settle." The information hit Jake like a physical blow. 5 years ago, he'd been working a case involving stolen army weapons that were being sold to hostile Indian tribes. The investigation had led him to a network of corrupt military officers and civilian contractors who were profiting from the illegal arms trade. He'd assumed all the perpetrators had been caught and prosecuted, but apparently at least one had escaped justice. "Fletcher was part of that smuggling ring," Jake said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why he knows so much about law enforcement procedures, why he's so good at staying ahead of investigations. He's been planning his revenge for 5 years. Clara's face paled as she understood the implications. This isn't just about stopping a criminal organization. This is personal for him. He's going to try to kill you no matter what happens with the train or the mine. Jake nodded grimly. "Which means we can't give him the chance. We end this today, one way or another." As they made their way back through the rocks toward Dutch and Thomas, Jake found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Clara about partnership and working together. He'd spent 15 years making decisions that affected only himself, taking risks that endangered only his own life. Now he was responsible for Clara's safety as well, and the weight of that responsibility was heavier than he'd expected, but it was also liberating in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time since Pete Summers' death, Jake felt like he was fighting for something larger than personal vengeance or professional duty. He was fighting to protect someone who mattered to him, someone whose faith in him made him want to be better than he'd ever been before. When they reached the cave where Dutch was guarding Thomas, they found both men engaged in an animated discussion about military tactics. Thomas, despite being a prisoner, was apparently offering suggestions about how to assault Fletcher's stronghold, based on his knowledge of the mine's layout. "About time you two got back," Dutch said, looking up from a rough map he'd drawn in. "The dirt. Your prisoner here has been telling me some interesting stories about Fletcher's operation." Thomas looked up from the map, his face drawn with pain but alert with purpose. "Morrison, if you're serious about attacking the mine, you need to know about the escape tunnels. Fletcher's got at least 3 different ways out of there, all leading to hidden exits miles from the main entrance. Why are you helping us?" Clara asked, "What's in it for you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Because Fletcher double-crossed me, same as he's double-crossed you. I was supposed to get a full share of the profits from our jobs, but he's been keeping most of the money for himself. When I got captured in Millbrook, he didn't try to rescue me. He sent those men to kill me, so I couldn't testify against him." The explanation rang true, but Jake remained suspicious. "And you think helping us will buy you better treatment from the federal court?" "Maybe, but mostly I think Fletcher deserves what's coming to him, and I want to be part of making sure he gets it." Thomas's smile was cold and vengeful. "Besides, Morrison, you're going to need all the help you can get. Fletcher's not just dangerous, he's smart, he's well-armed, and he's got nothing left to lose." Dutch spread out the map he'd been working on, showing the mine complex and the surrounding terrain. "Thomas here says there are at least 12 men. In Fletcher's gang, maybe more. They've got rifles, dynamite, and enough supplies to hold out for weeks if they have to." Jake studied the map, noting the defensive advantages Fletcher's position offered. The mine entrance was on high ground, with clear sight lines in all directions. The surrounding rocks provided excellent cover for defenders, while offering little protection for attackers. It was exactly the kind of position that military tacticians called nearly impregnable. Nearly impregnable wasn't the same as completely impregnable, but it was close enough to make Jake reconsider his options. A direct assault would be suicidal, and they didn't have the time or resources for a prolonged siege. "There might be another way," Clara said, studying the map with fresh eyes. "Thomas, you said Fletcher has escape tunnels. Do any of them run close to underground water sources?" Thomas frowned, thinking. "There's an old well about half a mile east of the main entrance. Why?" Clara's smile was both innocent and devious. "Because, gentlemen, I think it's time we gave Mr. Fletcher a taste of his own medicine. If he wants to play elaborate games, let's show him how creative we can be." As Clara outlined her plan, Jake found himself once again impressed by her ability to think outside conventional parameters. It was audacious, risky, and completely unexpected, exactly the kind of approach that might succeed where traditional tactics would fail. For the first time since discovering Fletcher's deception, Jake began to believe they might actually survive. The next 24 hours, the explosion echoed across the Texas hills like thunder, sending a column of black smoke rising from the abandoned silver mine. Clara Whitmore's plan had worked perfectly. By flooding the escape tunnels with water diverted from the underground spring, they'd forced Fletcher and his men to retreat deeper into the mine, where Thomas's knowledge of the layout had allowed them to plant dynamite charges in exactly the right locations. Jake Morrison emerged from behind the rocks where he'd taken cover, rifle in hand, watching the mine entrance for any signs of survivors. The blast had sealed the main tunnel, but he knew better than to assume their enemies were finished. Men like Fletcher didn't survive as long as he had without contingency plans. "Clara, report!" he called out. Her voice came from the ridge above the mine, where she'd positioned herself to watch the rear exits. 3 men came out the back tunnel before the explosion. "They're heading east toward the railroad tracks. That would be Fletcher and his most trusted lieutenants, abandoning their headquarters and their remaining men to save themselves. It was exactly what Jake had expected from a criminal who'd spent years betraying everyone around him. Dutch Vanover appeared from the rocks on the south side of the mine complex, his weathered face grim. Found 2 more trying to escape through the old ventilation shaft. They won't be causing any more trouble. Jake nodded, understanding the implication. In this kind of fight, there was no room for prisoners or second chances. Fletcher's gang had chosen their path when they decided to prey on innocent people. Thomas Garrett limped toward them from the position where Jake had stationed him, his injured wrist making movement difficult. Despite being their prisoner, he'd fought alongside them once the shooting started, proving that his desire for revenge against Fletcher was genuine. "Morrison," Thomas called out, breathing hard from exertion. "Fletcher's heading for the emergency rendezvous point. There's a hidden camp about 3 miles from here where he keeps fresh horses and supplies. If he reaches it, he'll disappear forever." Jake weighed their options. They'd succeeded in destroying Fletcher's headquarters and most of his organization, but the man himself was still free. As long as Fletcher was alive, he'd be planning his next move, building a new criminal network, seeking revenge against the people who'd brought down his empire. "How many men does he have with him?" Jake asked. 2, maybe 3. His best gunfighters, the ones he trusts to watch his back. Thomas's expression was pained, whether from his injuries or his memories. "There. Good, Morrison. Professionals. This won't be like dealing with small-town bank robbers." Clara made her way down from the ridge, moving with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous terrain. The events of the past few days had transformed her from a sheltered merchant's daughter into someone who belonged in this harsh world. "Jake, we can't let him escape," she said simply. "Not after everything he's done. Not after the people he's killed." Jake looked at her face, seeing the same determination that had driven him to become a bounty hunter 15 years earlier. Clara had found her calling in the most unlikely circumstances. And she was right. They couldn't let Fletcher disappear to start the cycle of violence all over again. "Dutch, can you handle getting Thomas back to Austin for trial?" The older man nodded. "I've transported prisoners before." "But Jake, you sure you want to go after Fletcher with just the 2 of you?" "He's desperate now, which makes him more dangerous than ever." "We'll manage," Jake replied, checking his weapons. Clara, "You ready for this?" She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it was the expression of someone completely at peace with her choices. "I've been ready since the moment I decided to leave Millbrook behind." The 3-mile ride to Fletcher's emergency camp took them through rough country, following a trail that showed signs of recent passage. Fletcher wasn't trying to hide his route. He was counting on speed rather than stealth to ensure his escape. They found the hidden camp in a box canyon surrounded by high walls of red stone. Fletcher had chosen the location well. There was only one way in or out, which meant no one could approach without being seen. But it also meant there was no escape if someone managed to get close enough. Jake and Clara left their horses at the canyon mouth and worked their way forward on foot, using the rocks and sparse vegetation for cover. As they got closer, they could hear voices, Fletcher giving orders to his remaining men, preparing for a final stand. "Morrison!" Fletcher's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you're out there. You've cost me everything, but you haven't won yet." Jake positioned himself behind a boulder that offered a clear view of the camp while keeping him protected from return fire. Clara took a position about 50 yards to his left, where she could cover a different angle of approach. "It's over." "Fletcher," Jake called back. "Your organization is finished. Your men are dead or captured, and there's nowhere left to run." Fletcher's laugh was bitter and desperate. "You think this is about the organization? You think I spent 5 years building this network just for money? This was always about you, Morrison. About making you pay for destroying my life in Kansas. The personal vendetta was clear now, but Jake felt no sympathy for the man who'd chosen a path of violence and corruption. You destroyed your own life when you decided to sell weapons to people who were using them to kill innocent settlers. Innocent? Fletcher's voice cracked with rage. You self-righteous fool. Those settlers were stealing land that belonged to the tribes. I was trying to level the playing field, and you destroyed me for it. Jake could see Fletcher now, standing in the open near a cooking fire, his two remaining gunmen flanking him with rifles ready. The criminal leader had abandoned any pretense of rationality, consumed by years of resentment and the fury of watching his carefully constructed empire collapse. "Fletcher," Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon, "you're not fighting for justice or balance. You're fighting because you can't accept responsibility for your own choices." The unexpected intervention from Clara seemed to surprise Fletcher more than anything Jake had said. "The little bride from Millbrook. Still playing at being a bounty hunter, I see. Tell me, girl, how many people have you killed since you decided to join Morrison's crusade?" "None," Clara replied calmly. "But I'm prepared to make an exception for someone who threatened to sell me into slavery." Fletcher's response was to raise his rifle and fire in Clara's direction, the bullet chipping stone inches from her position. It was the signal for the final confrontation to begin. Jake's first shot took out the gunman to Fletcher's left, a clean hit that dropped the man instantly. Clara's rifle spoke almost simultaneously, wounding the second gunman and sending him scrambling for cover behind the camp's supply wagon. Fletcher himself dove behind the cooking fire, using an overturned pot as an adequate cover while he tried to get a clear shot at either of his attackers. But the crossfire from Jake and Clara's positions made it impossible for him to aim effectively without exposing himself to return fire. "This ends now, Fletcher," Jake shouted, advancing from cover to cover as he closed the distance to the camp. Fletcher's final shot went wild, desperation ruining his aim. Jake's answering bullet found its mark, and the man who'd terrorized innocent communities across 3 territories fell beside his own campfire, his schemes and vendettas finally at an end. In the sudden silence that followed, Jake could hear Clara approaching through the rocks, her footsteps careful but confident. The wounded gunman had thrown down his weapon and was calling for medical attention, no longer a threat to anyone. "Is it over?" Clara asked, emerging into the camp with her rifle still ready. Jake checked Fletcher's body, confirming what he already knew. "It's over. The organization is finished, Fletcher's dead, and Thomas will testify against any remaining members who get arrested." Clara lowered her rifle, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. "What happens now?" "Now we collect the bounties, make sure Thomas gets the medical treatment he was promised, and decide what comes next." Jake looked at her, seeing the same question in her eyes that he was asking himself. "Clara, you've proven you can handle this work. The question is, do you want to?" She smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd found her purpose. "Jake Morrison, 3 days ago I was about to marry a criminal because it was expected of me. Today I helped bring down the largest criminal organization in 3 territories. I think I found what I was meant to do with my life." As they rode out of the canyon together, leading the wounded prisoner and carrying evidence of Fletcher's network, Jake reflected on how much had changed since he'd walked into that church in Millbrook. He'd gained a partner, discovered that justice was more complex than simple revenge, and learned that sometimes the most unlikely people turned out to be exactly what you needed. Behind them, the smoke from the destroyed mine was still visible. On the horizon, a monument to the end of Fletcher's criminal empire. Ahead lay Austin, where Judge Harrison would receive their evidence and begin the process of cleaning up the corruption they'd exposed. And beyond that lay the open trail, where Jake Morrison and Clara Whitmore would write the next chapter of their story together, bringing justice to a territory that desperately needed it. The church bells of Millbrook still rang in Jake's memory, but now they sounded like celebration rather than alarm. Sometimes he realized the best things in life began with the worst circumstances. Sometimes a wedding that never happened was exactly what everyone needed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.